The following is a collection of excerpts from a speech given by Herman Petzold in 1938 at the Lawrence, Massachusetts Veterans of Foreign Wars Association, presenting his experiences serving in World War I. These selections are only some of many and do not tell the entire story of his experiences overseas. However, they are his exact words as he would have presented the stories to an audience. The speech, when transcribed, is 40 pages long, so we chose to take these excerpts from those pages to provide insight into his life overseas. Because of this, the context in which he wrote these stories is not necessarily included, so we have taken the initiative to contextualize each story to help listeners to get a more wholesome understanding of his stories. We here at the North Andover High School History Learning Lab appreciate your interest and hope you can enjoy listening and learning. Herman Petzold was born on May 25, 1893 in Lawrence, Massachusetts. When Herman registered for the draft in 1917, he was 24 years old, employed as an architect, and lived on Thorndike Street in Lawrence. He entered the service in February 1918, where he trained at Camp Devens and Camp Upton for 4 weeks. He served in the 305th Infantry of the 77th Division, a division which would go on to see more active service, which is service under fire or on an active front, than any National Army or Guard divisions. After training in America, he traveled by boat to England on the Cunard Line ship Cedric. This excerpt describes one of his experiences from that voyage and the voyage from England to France. The 10th day out, I was down in this filthy hole getting my equipment ready for inspection when there was a terrific explosion, shaking the boat from end to end. In the next instant, everything was quiet. As I looked at the men around me, the blood seemed to be drawn from their faces, for everyone had turned white with a frantic look on their faces. Then, there was a grand rush for the staircase, and we went up and up and up, for we all wanted to be on top if the boat was sinking. On reaching the main deck, we found it was already swarming with soldiers, and greatly to our surprise, the boat wasn't sinking. Why? It hadn't even been hit. You can imagine our disappointment. Later we found out what really did happen. A cruiser discovered a submarine about 1/2 mile to our right, and had dropped a depth bomb down beside it. It was the explosion of this depth bomb that shook our boat from end to end, and that illustrated the enormous power behind one of those. The 14th day after sailing, we arrived at Liverpool, England. Our stay there was very brief, just long enough to leave the boat and board a train for Dover, where we expected to stay a week or more. Instead, the second morning in Dover, we received orders to sail for France. We were aboard the ship before breakfast, and, being hungry, we ate some canned tomatoes, corned willy, and crackers. I remember particularly drinking a huge quantity of water. Now, a liquid diet is not the best for a sea voyage. There were 5 boats in our convoy, and we set sail in a gale. I stood in the bow with the rain and wind in my face. I was there alone, watching for the coast of France. The waves were running higher than I had ever seen before. We rocked back and forth and up and down, and now and then the coast of France would appear and disappear. After landing in France, Petzold spent 1 week in an English rest camp on the outskirts of Calais before boarding a train. They spent the following 3 weeks hiking from village to village until they arrived on a high, flat plain south of Soissons, where they set up camp. For an hour that night, the sounds and sights of an air raid filled the sky. The next day they were on the move again. We traveled a number of days until we came to the Bachera sector of the Alsace-Lorraine front. That night, we went into the frontline trenches. During the time I was with this company, I became acquainted with most of the boys, and among them were some who were particularly fond of bragging about what they would do when they met the Germans. That very night, one of these boys was selected to go across the lines on a scouting party with 7 other men. I was standing beside him when his name was called. Even in the dark, I thought his face turned white and his lips seemed to quiver. But I didn't think anything for that, for we were all more or less nervous. We started out and were gone about half an hour when a German machine gun fired on us. We all fell to the ground and worked our way back. When we stopped to count our men, we found our bragging friend missing. What do you suppose happened? Why? The minute that gun started firing, he turned tail and ran for dear life, and when we arrived back in the trenches, there he was. His clothes were torn and his face scratched where he just flew through our own barbed wire entanglements. He bragged no more. He spent the next several weeks in and out of trenches on guard duty. Then, on one morning, they received orders to travel again, this time to go to a small village 25 miles south of Chateau Thierry, nestled on the side of a hill where they spent their next night. At noon the next day, we were packed into trucks and were on our way to the front lines. The trucks were driven by Chinese coolies, and they drove us through the ruined Chateau Terre beyond Belleau Wood. Late the next night, we stripped our packs to raincoat and iron rations and started hiking for the trenches. The road was jammed with soldiers and artillery, and the excitement was running high, for shells were bursting in our midst. We traveled along until we came to a right turn in the road, when the column came to a halt, and just as it did, the Germans opened up on us in earnest. Shells were falling all around us, but fortunately, most of them landed in the fields on either side of the road. We were glad when the column started moving again, for we felt a lot better moving than standing still. In a short time, we left the column and started through a field, single file. As we stumbled along, we met soldiers coming out of the trenches, whose places we were taking. It was a hot, dark night. We began to smell a terrible, strong odor, and it grew stronger and stronger. It seemed to stifle one, but we all had to grin and bear it. Just then, one of the outgoing boys passed us and said, "You are in hell now." I silently agreed. We filed into the trenches, or rather holes in the ground 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 1 foot deep, 1 man to each hole. After placing a guard, we lay in these holes trying to sleep, but sleep was impossible, for the shell fire continued throughout the night, and that terrible stench was still with us. I began to wonder what was the cause of the smell. As dawn approached, I could see distinguished dead bodies on the ground in front of us. I watched them closely, and it seemed as though I saw an eye move, and it was moving with hundreds of maggots crawling in and out of the eye sockets. It was these rotting bodies which caused the terrible stench. At the end of his stay there, Petzold was selected to go back with a scout from the relieving company to help determine their route of departure and new location. They were following the road until Germans spotted them and started firing, at which point they had to duck and cover for the next half mile. They found the new location after another half mile, and Petzold was sent back to retrieve his company to lead them there. They were treated with many entertaining sights from this new spot, such as a dogfight between 2 American planes and 1 German plane. Late one night, we went back into the frontline trenches. We were in the trenches making ourselves comfortable for the night, if such a thing were possible, when I heard a terrific rush of air. Upon hearing a rush of air on the battlefield, the best one can do is fall flat on the ground. If you don't, you'll probably be blown to bits. My partner and I fell flat. There was a deafening explosion covering us with dirt, almost a direct hit. We got up and were congratulating ourselves on being missed when we heard another rush of air. Another shell in the same spot. This time we went down and stayed down, and somehow or another escaped being blown to pieces. Over the next 2 weeks we made a number of advances, and late one evening we took over a line of German trenches and had to stand to all night, for we expected an attack. Early the next morning I was standing in the trench, watching when I took my helmet off to wipe the perspiration from my face, when a shell exploded directly in front. When a shell bursts in front of you, you have no warning. I heard bits of shell whizzing past my head, and the next instant I felt blood trickling down the side of my forehead. A piece of shell had evidently grazed my forehead, cutting the skin open, and although it wasn't anything serious, the commanding officer sent me to the company doctor to have the wound dressed. After dressing the wound and being about to send me back, I saw him looking down at my open shirt. "I guess you will have to go to the hospital after all. You have the German measles." After arriving at the field hospital, Herman was told that he had been gassed instead of having the German measles. The next day, he was taken in an ambulance to a hospital in Chateau Terre, where he spent a night, before being taken by train to another hospital in France. They ended up in Paris, where they traveled all over the city looking for a hospital. Herman was able to see the Arc de Triomphe, Notre Dame, and the Eiffel Tower. After spending 10 days in a bed, he was sent to a replacement camp, where one night at 10 o'clock, he witnessed the last air raid over Paris. After spending time in this camp, he made his way back by train to the front. He arrived and met up with his platoon. That afternoon, I was advanced to sergeant, and was told we were going to the front lines that night, so I arrived just in time to go into the trenches. While we were waiting for night to come so we could advance, German artillery made a direct hit on a long, narrow barn about 100 yards from our position. It proved to be an ammunition depot, having vast stores of shells and gunpowder in it. The building burst into shooting flames, sending out shower after shower of exploding shells, and you can well believe we were highly entertained for the next 6 or 7 hours. It was still burning at 11 p.m. when we left for the trenches. Our trench was at the top of a steep hill, but instead of entering, we occupied dugouts just below. In a short time, the artillery drill between the Americans and Germans started, and it was the worst I had ever witnessed. It seemed like one continuous explosion lasting from midnight until 5 o'clock in the morning. The concussion from the exploding shells was so immense that one could hardly breathe, and the noise so loud that one was almost deaf. The very hill shook and trembled through the whole night. Our trenches had been blown to pieces, and our barbed wire entanglements were laying flat. We received the signal to go over the top at 5:30 a.m., and we started on our advance. Much to our surprise, not a shot was fired against us. The ground in front of us was blown to pieces, including the German trenches. Not even a blade of grass was left. We went along about 100 yards and came to a thick growth of bushes about 4 feet high. The leaves were heavily laden with the dew, and we had to work our way through this for 1/2 mile until we came to the edge on a steep ravine. When we arrived at this position, we were soaked to the skin, and the only resistance we encountered was a little rear guard action of the shell fire. Myself and 2 squads brought up the extreme left of our company, and up to this point I had lost 2 men wounded. We paused at the edge of the ravine, and I looked across. I thought to myself, what a strong position for the Germans if they are waiting on the other side for us. We started down, and it was so steep that we had to hang on to the bushes as we slid along. Halfway down, we came to a roadway with a narrow gauge railroad, and on the side of the ravine at this point was a row of German dugouts with padlocked doors. As we reached this roadway, machine guns began firing, and for a moment we felt we were trapped in a crossfire, a small knee-deep stream, and pulled ourselves up to the other side. Here we found an empty German trench, and I wonder to this day why the Germans didn't occupy this trench. If they had, they could have annihilated our entire company. We went a little further until we came to the edge of a highway. Here we paused to rest.